and he smiles, 'cause no one can put him down. Inside him a boy looks up to his father for a sign or an approving eye. Oh, it's funny how those once so close are now gone, still so affect our lives.
Oh, si es,
I'm coming,
oh, si es,
I'll be coming.
sin Sofía, where Mama no más.
You know the tide is turning.
Oh, si es, oh, si es,
You know the tide is turning.
si acuya lo clava,
Make my crossing
si abuela la peche,
over the stark land.
soltaba señal,
Gonna touch your face,
la pasó pega paz,
gonna lay me down in your grace. Take me now, don't let go. Hold me close, I'm coming home.
Oh, si es,
Oh, I'm coming.
oh, si es,
Oh, I'm coming.
sin Sofía, where Mama no más.
You know the tide is turning.
Oh, si es,
I'm telling you the tide is turning.
acuya lo clava,
Gonna make this crossing
abuela la peche,
over the stark land.
soltaba señal,
Gonna touch your face,
la pasó pega paz,
gonna lay me down in that green field of grain.
oh, si es,
Oh, I'm coming.
oh, si es,
Oh, I'm coming.
sin Sofía,
Oh, I'm coming.
no más.
Oh, I'm coming.
Oh, si es,
Oh, I'm coming.
oh, si es,
Gonna lay me down.
si acuya lo clava, si abuela
Gonna make my crossing
peche,
over the stark land.
soltaba señal,
Gonna touch your face,
la pasó pega paz,
gonna lay me down in the green fields of grass.
oh, si esa, oh, si esa, sin Sofía, where Mama no más. Oh, si esa, oh, si
It looks vaguely Egyptian, doesn't it? But it should do. It's even called the Egyptian building. Moses wasn't here, though plenty of Jews were. Built in 1839 when Egyptomania was all the rage in England, largely as a byproduct of the Napoleonic Wars and the acquisition of the Rosetta Stone by the British Museum, this was the first official building of the South African College, the high school that was to become the University of Cape Town. It remains the oldest building in use on the university's campuses. The roll call of notable self-identifying Jews who subscribed in 1829 and became foundation shareholders included Dr. Siegfried Frankl, the ship's surgeon who had made Cape Town his new home, Isaac Manuel, and Maximilian Thelwitzer, the Sheep King. Nearly a century later, the students of UCT were given the nickname Ikeys by the rival University of Stellenbosch, largely because of the high percentage of Jewish enrollment. Jewish involvement in civil society in South Africa began early. One of the first students at the South African College was young Saul Solomon, sent to Cape Town at age 12 from St. Helena Island by his family expressly to study. His uncle, also Saul Solomon, was the Sheriff of St. Helena, representative of the British administration. It appears to have been a strong and remarkable family. Nathaniel Isaacs of Sharker's chicken soup fame was also a cousin. Most of the family ended up in Cape Town, and Saul Jr. rose to become a leading member of the Cape Legislature. He was also apprenticed when young to a printer, a Mr. Gregg of St. George's Street, and together with his younger brother Henry, they eventually purchased the printing business and scooped the contract to print the Government Gazette in addition to other government documents. 15 years later, they became the printers of the Cape Argus and later became the proprietors of the highly esteemed and influential newspaper, Saul managing to balance being a member of Parliament and a member of the Fourth Estate with little difficulty. In the field of journalism before Saul Solomon, a Sephardic Jew from the Netherlands, one Joseph Swasso de Lima, had published a Dutch newspaper in Cape Town called De Versamelaar, the Collector. Solomon's story and his eminence in the general community is a good indication of the relative ease with which Jews could cross into the civic world of early Cape Town. One of the major reasons being the legislated freedom of religion that the British had inherited from the Batavian Republic. Saul did convert to Anglicanism along with his brother, but maintained a strong connection with the practicing Jewish community, attending Passover Seders and other festivals, as well as a strong friendship with the new rabbi, Reverend Joel Rabinowitz. A willingness to convert in order to better assimilate into formal society was comparatively prevalent amongst Anglo-German Jews who came of age in the wake of the Emancipation and the Enlightenment. In South Africa, it did occur from time to time, but could never be tagged as a dominant or preferable choice. More Jews were simply non-practicing, and the arrival of the more intensely religious Eastern European immigrants meant it became an exception apart from the later landlords, who saw it as their way to finally break through from their upper middle class existence into the headier realm of the aristocracy. They also saw it as good business practice. By that stage, though, anti-Semitism had become a public expression and more overt. But in the earlier story of Jewish South Africa in the Cape Colony, being Jewish was no real hindrance to being part of civic life. As small villages became towns and the British colonial government instituted the structures of British civil administration, Jewish names cropped up with great regularity as municipal councillors, justices of the peace, and members of parliament. There was also a surprising presence of Jews in the military, particularly in the early defense of border towns. The first Jewish mayor of Cape Town was Hyman Lieberman, a distinction he achieved no less than 3 times. Born in Poland and raised in England, he nevertheless retained a thick Yiddish accent even as he swore his oath of office. He maintained his position within the Jewish community while he served the Cape Town City Council, being a warden and sometime president of the Cape Town Hebrew congregation. When he died, his funeral procession was one of the longest ever seen in this city as it wound its way through the streets of the city bowl. Isaac Bauman, who holds the distinction of being the first Jew in Bloemfontein, became so entrenched in civic affairs that when his daughter married, a public holiday was declared to enable President Brunt and his Volksraad, or Parliament, to attend the wedding. A similar story can be found in the establishment of the Johannesburg Township, but there the Jewish community was in at the ground floor. By the way, another town in South Africa can claim literal Jewish roots alongside Joburg. One of the biggest railway junctions in South Africa is situated at De Aar, which started as a farm belonging to the Friedlander brothers, who bought the trading concession to the railway construction site and built an hotel and a trading store. Apart from some time in the hands of the military during the Anglo-Boer War, the hotel, eventually renamed the Hotel de Aar by proprietor Abraham Radomski, is a perfect example of the Jewish country hotels that could be found the length and breadth of the country. Why was the hotel industry of South Africa so much the preserve of the Jewish community, beginning with the first boarding houses in District 6 and ending with the international hospitality empire of Sol Kerzner? Was it because of a tradition of hostelry and innkeeping amongst the immigrants from Eastern Europe, or can we trace it back to the very beginning and the hospitality Abraham offered his visitors? I'll have the gefilte fish. Whatever the reason, Jewish travelers throughout the country could always be assured of a Hamish, if not necessarily completely kosher welcome, as they journeyed from place to place. And many a Boer or Brit had their first taste of chicken soup and kneidlach at such establishments. Back to Johannesburg and the rise of the good civic burghers there. As the city expanded from a mining camp to a township, and from a township into a bustling town, and then a full-fledged city, and the largest one in South Africa at that, much of its development and expansion came from Jewish property developers. Barney Bernato himself purchased large tracts of land with the express purpose of developing them for both residential and commercial purposes. But after his mysterious death at sea, they were ceded to the Johannesburg Consolidated Investment Company, which he had founded. Like most developing cities, the kernel, in this case the area around Market Square, including Marshallstown and Ferreirastown, was developed outwards in a spiral. The Goldreich brothers joined with Emanuel Mendelssohn and went north, expanding settlement up the ridge of White Waters to create Hillbrow, which, once it became the high-rise magnet for Johannesburg apartment dwellers, was for a long time the most densely populated square mile in the southern hemisphere. To the east lay an extremely desirable swathe that included Doornfontein and Bez Valley, both once home of many a landlord mansion before Parktown Ridge became even more desirable. Beyond them was the area which Max Langeman bought up and turned into the suburb of Kensington, and it was there that he donated the ground for the first purpose-built Jewish orphanage. The Goldreich brothers spread further, developing Regent's Park and Wanderer's View, but one of the most impressive and long-lasting expansions remained the territory of one family. Whereas the names of Langeman and Goldreich are memorialized in street names, Leo Rosettenstein and his family are remembered in the name of an entire suburb, Rosettenville. Papa Leo also added Turfentine, Rosettenville Extension and Kenilworth to the family portfolio, all to the south of Johannesburg city centre. Back in the old country, Jews had been denied property rights, but here such things as mortgages were available, and owning property was something that the new immigrants could aspire to. As Johannesburg developed, the Jewish community moved both physically and in status northeast from Doornfontein to Troyville and Yeoville, and from there to Berea, Mountain View and Orange Grove, and then the heady heights of Houghton, where one could be said to have truly made it. In a directional reversal, Cape Townian Jews travelled from the city bowl to the grander southern suburbs, though a sizable community staked their claim on the Atlantic coast, making Sea Point a near-Jewish neighbourhood. And in terms of neighbourhoods, Cape Town's District 6 was often described as the equivalent of Manhattan's Lower East Side. Time and the apartheid government's bulldozing of District 6 has virtually erased the traces of the District 6 Jewish presence, apart from a few buildings. In Johannesburg, the Doornfontein High Street, Byte Street, named for Sir Alfred Byte, was once a Jewish thoroughfare with Goldenberg's and Wachenheimer's butcheries and Crystal's bakery and numerous small shops, including the American ice cream factory. And a little further down the road, the Alhambra cinema screened Yiddish films like A Brivele de Mama and The Dibboek. Contemporary Johannesburg has a few intersecting streets with fishmongers, butcheries, supermarkets, restaurants and the like in the heart of the new Jewish shtetl, serving the kosher community, while Sea Point has but a few individual stores that can still be termed Jewish. London-born Sir Harry Grauman was the first Jewish mayor of Johannesburg, and his rise to that position was a remarkable story of enterprise and daring. He had arrived in South Africa as a teenager and found work with a wholesale company at a salary of 30 shillings a month, all found. As he said himself, at the end of the month, there was very little to find. He did some trading in ostrich feathers to supplement his salary and decided to become a commercial broker. He was so young, he was known as the boy broker, probably no more than 16 years old. After some successful trading in the Eastern Cape and Natal, he headed for the goldfields of the Transvaal, became the youngest stockbroker in Barberton. Thereafter, his rise was unstoppable, and he ended up on the Witwatersrand as a financier. Throughout the knotty complexity of the Anglo-Boer War, Harry was everywhere. As chairman of the War Refugee Committee in Cape Town, corresponding with and advising Lord Roberts in the Transvaal, and working towards reconciliation between Afrikaners and English speakers. He became deputy mayor in 1908, and the following year was unanimously elected mayor. His mayoral service was held at the Park Synagogue, with both Rabbi Landau and Rabbi Hertz officiating. Harry went on to initiate the building of the Johannesburg City Hall, the town council having met before its existence in a collection of corrugated iron buildings near the Park Synagogue, commonly known as the Tin Temple. He declined to serve a second term as mayor, received a knighthood in 1923, and eventually retired to Sea Point, and died there just before the Second World War. Grauman's story and others like it may give the impression that public attitudes towards Jews in South Africa at that time were relaxed, accommodating, and generally welcoming. And in some instances, they were. But it should be remembered that Grauman's rise and that of similar notable public Jewish figures played out against a distressing coagulation of harsh, vocal anti-Semitism.
Harry Grauman cut a fine figure in his mayoral robes and chain, but the most prominent Jew in the general population's mind was literally a caricature, a line drawing of a corpulent, hook-nosed, grasping plutocrat called Hoggenheimer, drawn by D.C. Boonzaier and published in the South African News. South Africans delighted in Hoggenheimer. He became the symbol for them of all the exploitative landlords, capitalists, and industrialists, responsible for all the miseries and woes of the existence. But most of all, he was the symbol for them of all the greedy, heartless, and extortionate, funny-speaking foreign Jews. Though Boonzaier denied it, Hoggenheimer looked more and more like the equivalent anti-Semitic caricatures that were to be found across Europe and North America, and would reach their apotheosis in Der Stürmer, the Nazi propaganda newspaper.
The shift from warm and welcoming perceptions of the Jew amongst the rural Afrikaners, the people of the book, their history reflects ours, to a competitive rivalry and distrust centered on the build-up to the Anglo-Boer War. In particular, it finds focus on the Uitlanders, literally foreigners, or those from outside the land.
These were all the foreigners who came to South Africa after the Dutch occupation, and by the waning decades of the 19th century, the term was specifically applied to those foreigners who came to the Boer republics in pursuit of mineral wealth and adventure. The second wave of Jewish immigration formed a sizable percentage, though the vast majority were of British origin. Among the Uitlanders were those who were supportive of British imperialist aspirations. Barney Bernardo was one. And there were those who were supportive of Boer nationalism. Remember Sammy Marks? The landlords were perceived as being strongly in the British camp, and by the time the whole messy farrago of the Jameson raid happens, the idea that the mining magnates and capitalist financiers were responsible for the push towards war takes hold amongst the Afrikaner nationalists. And since many of the magnates and financiers were Jewish or of Jewish origin, the old canard of international Jewish capitalism being responsible for this and other wars finds acceptance. Yet there were Jews who fought on the side of the Boer commandos and served with distinction. Joseph Jackal Siegel and Wolf Jacobson were not only loyal to the Boer cause, they were bitter einders and fought with them to the bitter end. In the shadow of the Boer War lies another remarkable South African Jewish story. Mohandas K. Gandhi, best known as the Mahatma, began his political life in South Africa as an activist on behalf of the Indian population.
He arrived in South Africa as a young lawyer to represent a local Indian businessman, but his observation of the experience of the Indian community led him to the fight for their rights and against their treatment by the British colonial authority, particularly the pass laws, as well as their restricted immigration. And it all happened at the same time as the Jewish community was engaged in its immigration struggles. Like the Jewish Ambulance Corps of Johannesburg during the Anglo-Boer War, Gandhi formed an Indian ambulance corps in which he served, and it was subsequent to the war that he formulated his passive resistance principles of satyagraha, which attracted admirers and followers, including a small, dedicated group of Jews. As he himself wrote, in South Africa, I was surrounded by Jews. That's Gandhi, Sonia Schlesinger, and Herman Kallenbach.
Among them was his partner in his law firm, Henry Pollack, as well as Henry's wife Minnie, and Sonia Schlesinger, who raised funds for the Satyagrahi and organized food and other support when many of them were imprisoned. Gandhi's closest friend was Herman Kallenbach, a Jewish architect who had emigrated to South Africa from Germany. The two even shared this house in Orchards, Johannesburg, which Kallenbach had designed specifically for Gandhi. Kallenbach and Gandhi shared many ideas and hosted discussion groups at the house, which was where Gandhi did much of his writing, with Sonia serving as his secretary. Kallenbach, who also shared his interest in the writings and philosophy of Leo Tolstoy, donated his farm property outside Johannesburg as a home for the followers of Gandhi who had limited means. Known as Tolstoy Farm, Gandhi lived there for a while, as well as Kallenbach, who designed a school that was built on the property. Kallenbach sailed with Gandhi to England, but when the First World War broke out, he was detained as an enemy alien because of his German birth and interned on the Isle of Man, thwarting his plans to be with Gandhi on his return to India. He sailed back to South Africa and continued his work as an architect, all the while maintaining their correspondence. When Hitler began his rise to power, Kallenbach became an ardent Zionist and supporter of the kibbutz movement, and he was asked to elicit Gandhi's public support for a Jewish national homeland. On this, the two great friends disagreed, because Gandhi felt the Jews of Germany should counter Hitler's policy with the principles of Satyagraha. Despite this gulf between them, their friendship and correspondence continued until Kallenbach's death in 1945. Herman Kallenbach left the bulk of his estate to Israel and his library to the Hebrew University. He is buried on Kibbutz Degania in the Galilee.
Kallenbach's story is an indication of how diverse opinions and allegiances were within the South African Jewish community. It's very easy to look back and regard it as a monolithic unit, and it may in fact have been regarded as such by the general South African society, but the reality was very different. From divergent religious viewpoints and practices to community disagreements over representation and authority, the Jewish community was large enough and flexible enough to sustain an impressive variety of attitudes and beliefs, particularly when engaging with the greater civil society and the body politic.
The strong and historic connection of a section of the Pale of Settlement Jews with the rising labor movement and socialist politics stuttered somewhat in South Africa.
For one thing, when the immigrants arrived here, they found the position of laborers more than adequately filled by the indigenous population. The Jewish workers were always going to be elevated at least one class above by virtue of their skin color, whether they aspired to this or not.
While there were certainly Jewish tailors and seamstresses and milliners, for example, we never had the sweatshops and Jewish worker, Jewish boss conflicts that were so much a part of Lower Manhattan in the United States. In Cape Town, there was a brief swell of cooperatives and union-like labor organizations that attempted to protect some Jewish workers who were tailors and carpenters and bakers, but they soon disappeared or lost their identity as they were absorbed into largely British unions that were represented in the Cape Colony. It was in Cape Town, too, that a branch of the Socialist Bund was established, but it too disappeared. Early Johannesburg could boast such specific proto-unions as the Jewish Cab Drivers Association and a few Jewish tailors' guilds. These were also absorbed by the larger unions of British origin when they arrived and were, of course, whites only. It was again the threat of immigration restrictions and quotas that pushed many Jews towards the South African Labour Party, and some rose to the forefront, including Charles Klingman, who became party secretary in 1914. The following year, a branch of the International Socialist League was established in Johannesburg. It became so popular that within the year it began to publish its documents, flyers, and broadsheets in Yiddish, as well as English and Nederlands. And let's not forget that when the accounts of the Tsar's abdication made their way to the mining town, there were riotous celebrations where Jews, quote, danced in the streets, unquote. The Yiddish Arbeiter Club sustained the fight for workers' rights at the same time it waved the banner for its cultural activities and Yiddishist founding principles. Its own newsletter was called the Proletarische Stimme, the proletarian voice. Many of its members became founders of the South African Communist Party, and from their ranks came two significant trade unionists.
Solly Sachs was born in a Lithuanian shtetl and came to South Africa in 1914. He lived with his family in Malay Camp, a deprived slum area in Greater Johannesburg, where they endured sustained hardship. Since he lived there and worked in a concession store in this multiracial settlement, Sachs grew up witnessing both racial and worker discrimination. And his path through socialism into the Communist Party was assured. Eventually, he became the General Secretary of the Garment Workers Union.
Paradoxically, the Garment Workers Union members were for the most part white Afrikaner women, who were being assiduously courted by Afrikaner nationalists. But Solly kept these female workers within the union camp by establishing an individual branch for mixed-race members. When the National Party came to power in 1948, they systematically targeted the Communist Party, and Solly was eventually banned under the Suppression of Communism Amendment Act in 1952. He elected to go into exile in Britain. And for those of you who don't know, Solly was the father of Albie Sachs, himself an activist and later Justice of the Supreme Court of the new democratic South Africa. Ray Alexander was born in Latvia, in a small town where her father was a teacher and ardent socialist. She joined the communist underground there at a very young age, but her mother sent her to study in Lithuania, mindful of the strong level of anti-Semitism at the Latvian universities. Fearing her imminent arrest because of her political activities, Ray, born Rochel, was sent to South Africa to join her brother and sister, but within a week of landing had joined the Communist Party here.
Like Sachs, she became the Secretary General of a union, in this case a multiracial one, the Food and Canning Workers Union of the Western Cape. She too was banned as a communist repeatedly. As one order expired, another was instituted. She stood for Parliament as a native representative. Blacks were barred from the legislature by the apartheid laws, but were allowed limited representation by a few token white members. But on election, she was barred from Parliament and not allowed to take her seat. In fact, she was physically pushed down these stairs by an over-enthusiastic policeman. She had married Jack Simons, an academic at Wits University who was also served with a banning order and prevented from teaching. In the face of sustained harassment by the authorities, the two elected to go into exile in Zambia. Jews had been elected to the colonial legislatures in the Cape and Natal, but the constitution of Kruger's South African Republic forbade the franchise and election to the Volksraad to anyone who was not a professed Calvinist. After union in 1910, a small but significant representation from the Jewish community sought election to the Union Parliament. By 1915, there were 5 Jewish representatives, including one who stood as a National Party candidate, and in the 20s, there were 7 major Jewish representatives elected to Parliament, including Morris Alexander and Morris Kentridge.
A pact between the Labour Party and the Nationalist Party and dissatisfaction with Smuts over the Rand Revolt led to JBM Hertzog becoming Prime Minister in 1924. 6 years later, this government tabled and passed the Immigration Quota Act, which effectively throttled Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, making the distinction between desirable and undesirable immigrants, which was entirely dependent on their country of origin. The link between most South African Jews and their country of origin was thus severed. For the next decade, the engagement of the Jewish community with civil society around them would be overshadowed by increasingly strident anti-Semitism. In a reflection of what was happening in Europe, and because of the complex history of deepening antipathy between Afrikaner nationalism and British imperialism, it was almost inevitable that fascist groups supportive of Hitler and the Nazi Party would make their appearance in South Africa. The effects of the Depression were felt by nearly all South African society, but in Afrikaner nationalist eyes, Jewish capitalist interests were responsible for the plight of poor whites and particularly poor Afrikaners. First came the Landsgruppe Suid-Afrika, formed at the University of Cape Town no less, and more significant was the establishment of the South African Gentile and National Socialist movement with its headquarters in Cape Town, but with branch representation across the country. The members were soon referred to as the Grey Shirts.
This was the time of die Joodse Vraagstuk, the Jewish question. It was a question that was increasingly and openly asked on the streets, in the newspapers, and here in Parliament. The question was inherited from Europe and had been asked in many forms. In essence, it asked what to do about the Jews and what was their position in society and how could their encroaching presence be controlled.
In Parliament, the answer was the increasingly restrictive bills pertaining to immigration. But in the plethora of Afrikaner nationalist groups like the Grey Shirts, the answer was picketing, demonstrations, and a torrent of openly anti-Semitic leaflets and handbills. The measure of sympathy Jews may have felt for the Afrikaner cause, in which some thought paralleled the Jewish national aspirations, soon evaporated. Afrikaner support for Zionism also faded, as Afrikaner society increasingly identified with the German cause, particularly in their ongoing struggle with Britain.
The Jewish community tried to counter the increasingly hostile atmosphere through an appeal to the civil courts. When the Grey Shirts claimed to have uncovered material that proved the existence of an international Jewish conspiracy, a thinly disguised variation on the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the Jewish Board of Deputies decided that they could make a case for libel, since the document was purportedly signed by the rabbi of the synagogue in which the document was supposedly found. The trial was held in the Grahamstown division of the Supreme Court, and the court found in favor of the prosecution, denouncing the documents as insidious forgeries. One of the details that helped prove the board's case was Hebrew lettering, printed on some of the pages. They read, Kosher LePesach, suitable for Passover. Clearly, the forgers had no idea of their meaning.
The government of South Africa had changed once more since Smuts and Hertzog had formed a union between their respective South African Party and National Party. The United South African National Party was known by most as the United Party. But where did that leave D.F. Malan, Hertzog's deputy? He broke away to form a purified National Party. Initially, his opposition was to future Jewish immigration, not the already present Jewish community. But under his leadership, his party soon began to voice opinions in favor of the expulsion of the Jews and suggesting an alliance of the English and Afrikaners as a united Nordic front against them. The Grey Shirts may have had to lick the wounds inflicted by the Supreme Court judgment, but they didn't go away and continued recruiting members. In 1938, the Afrikaner community celebrated the centenary of the Great Trek, the mass Boer migration from the Cape to the interior, with a reenactment that culminated in Pretoria, where the foundation stone of the Voortrekker monument was laid. Ostensibly cultural in nature, the celebration had some sinister offshoots, including the formation of a group known as the Ossewa Brandwag, the Oxwagon Sentinel. Its paramilitary structure echoed that of the Nazi brown shirts and was further cemented by its later offshoot called the Stormjaars, the Stormtroopers. All of this was of deep concern for the Jews of South Africa, who sought ways of countering the intensifying anti-Semitism among the Afrikaner nationalists. D.F. Malan tried to veil the increasingly anti-Jewish platform of the Purified National Party, declaring that its intentions were misinterpreted. At the same time, Eric Lowe, long an aggressive enemy of the Jewish community, had no such qualms and tabled a private member's bill to deprive immigrants of any rights to naturalization. Many of his bill's proposals were modeled on the Nuremberg laws, including definitions of Jewish identity and the restriction of occupations and trades.
It should be pointed out that a segment of the Jewish community suggested in the 30s that perhaps Jewish immigration to South Africa should be suspended to mitigate the strident anti-Semitism they were facing. They thought that in this way they might placate the fears of the general white population of the country.
The declaration of war by the British government in 1939 upended the politics of South Africa. Despite his coalition partners' endorsement and support of neutrality, Smuts narrowly won the parliamentary vote for the Union of South Africa to enter the war on the side of Great Britain. Hertzog immediately resigned and crossed the floor to the nationalists, who renamed themselves the Reunited National Party. The Afrikaner nationalists allied their movement more and more with Nazi Germany.
The Jewish community enthusiastically supported Smuts and threw themselves into the war effort.
At this stage, the members of the community who were eligible for military service were mostly South African born, and memories of the British support of Tsarist Russia had receded into the past. More than 10% of the Jewish population joined up and marched off to war, seeing service in the various branches of the Defense Force and its support wings. On the home front, the community busied itself with relief organizations such as the Jewish War Appeal, which coordinated its efforts with the American Joint Distribution Committee, the equivalent arm of United States Jewry. The Joint Distribution Committee directed its attention to the plight of refugees from the very beginning, and the majority of the South African Jewish War Appeal's efforts were similarly channeled. Many of the women's guilds attached to the synagogues across the country formed committees to send assistance and comfort parcels to Jewish servicemen. As part of the Union Defense Force, most South African Jewish servicemen saw action in North Africa as some of the so-called desert rats, and many were interned after the fall of Tobruk. Others saw service in the Middle East, while yet others formed part of the Allied invasion of Italy and fought in the Anzio campaign and the Battle of Monte Cassino. Joe Slovo was one of the contingents who were based for some time in Italy. The Jewish soldiers were well served by a contingent of Jewish chaplains, and synagogue services were held in the makeshift accommodations, though there were a few purpose-built constructions, particularly in North Africa. The senior chaplain of the British Army was Louis Rabinowitz, who saw service in the Middle East too. Shortly after his demob at the end of the war, he was appointed the new chief rabbi of South Africa.
While in active service, the Jewish holidays, where possible, were also observed, and one Essie Silberman described a Pesach Seder held in the open air under an Egyptian sky as particularly memorable for obvious reasons. He referred to the Knedlach as rubbery, though, but Jewish debate about the quality of Knedlach has been a long-standing one, and it's yet to be resolved. In this instance, the servicemen were compensated by having matzot and wine from neighboring Palestine especially brought in for their Seder.
It started after the First World War, around about 1921. It wasn't known as the Jewish Ex-Service League then. And after the Second World War, it became the South African Jewish Ex-Service League. And most of its members, of course, were members or veterans from the Second World War. And unfortunately, it's getting smaller and smaller because it's many years since the end of the Second World War. There is a South African Jewish National War Memorial at West Park Cemetery, and the South African Jewish Ex-Service League hold a memorial service there every year on the Sunday between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And we have plaques on this memorial, which incidentally is in the shape of a wall. And it's supposed to represent the Kotel, the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And we have plaques there for the First World War, and with names, Second World War, the Israeli wars, the border wars, and we have 2 empty spaces, but with a plaque that one reads the unknown soldier, because we have that there in case we've left out a name. We honor the unknown soldier, and we have another plaque for the Holocaust victims.
One of the most notable airmen during the Second World War was Cecil Margot, who had trained as an Air Force pilot while studying for his law degree. He served in the South African Air Force, flying missions in North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. After flying 190 missions, he was given the command of the 24th Bomber Squadron. He was awarded both the Distinguished Service Order and the Distinguished Flying Cross, and was requested to lead the VE Day flypast over Vienna of 1,000 Allied aircraft. He returned to his legal practice after the war, but was personally requested by David Ben-Gurion to be chief advisor on the formation of the Israeli Air Force.
Though he was offered the position of commander of the new Air Force, Margot returned to South Africa to his wife and family and rose in the legal ranks here, taking silk as a Queen's Counsel, and eventually was appointed a Justice of the Supreme Court. Back home, Jewish involvement in the war effort continued. In Durban, one of the great community institutions and a source of pride was the Durban Jewish Club, situated in a custom-designed building on Old Fort Road. The club facilities were placed at the disposal of the Union Defence Forces, and the canteen and rest and relaxation facilities were provided by the Union of Jewish Women and the Durban community to all servicemen and women, regardless of religious affiliation. Durban was the port of embarkation for those serving up north, as well as a stop for Allied convoys sailing to the Far East, and the club facilities were stretched beyond their capacity, with no one turned away. By the end of 1941, more than 47,000 meals had already been served, and since the cooking was handled by the women of the Jewish community, many a non-Jewish soldier or sailor had their first taste of Jewish food at the club canteen. By the war's end, and with the club returned to the community, it was finally totted up that over 2 million members of the armed forces had passed through the doors, and 750,000 meals served. The club and the community were officially commended by Field Marshal Smuts for their war effort. It still functions as a Jewish center for the Durban community today. The horror of the fate of European Jews began filtering through to the South African community early in 1941. The Board of Deputies had not stopped defending the South African community against the anti-Semitic provocations of the Ossewa Brandwacht, but in 1940 they had to contend with a new openly pro-Nazi party, Die Nieuwe Orde, or New Order, founded by Oswald Pirro. Attempts at alerting the general population to the German atrocities were met by denials from Afrikaner nationalists, though some Christian clergy and non-Jewish leaders addressed mass meetings, expressing their dismay and protesting Nazi actions.
In 1942, the Jewish Board of Deputies began a series of official days of mourning for the Jews of Europe. Special synagogue services were held around the country, and Jewish businesses closed to allow for the expression of grief and protest in community gatherings. In addition, the board lobbied again for the relaxation of the immigration restrictions that blocked the chance of any Jewish refugees being allowed in. Smuts gave as his reasons for maintaining the restrictions that transport to South Africa was serving the armed forces, and the resources of the country, including food supply, were mobilized for the war effort. Above all, he stated that an influx of Jewish refugees would exacerbate the already heightened expressions of anti-Semitism in the country.
During the early years of the war, a kind of soldiers' union had been formed in North Africa amongst the South African servicemen, with Jock Isaacowitz as one of its leaders. It became known as the Springbok Legion, and although short-lived, its initial activities attracted the attention and support of many of the Jewish servicemen and women. Strongly anti-fascist and anti-racist, it had amongst its leadership Joe Slovo, Lionel Bernstein, Wolfie Kodesh, and Harry Schwartz. Later, it would give rise to a further offshoot, the Torch Commando, which would play an important role in the politics of South Africa in the 50s. By the war's end, the attention of the local Jewish community was focused on the destruction of European Jewry and on whatever support and help the community could muster.
Concern for the fate of Jewish refugees and the reunification of surviving family members led to renewed lobbying of Smuts's government for relaxation of the immigration laws. This was not to be. Between 1946 and 1948, a total of 1,512 Jewish immigrants were allowed into the country. Smuts held fast to his belief that the Jewish refugees would be better served by going to Palestine, and his government maintained that the absorption of any more immigrants would place a strain on the already overburdened economy in the wake of the war. Direct Jewish involvement in government and civil affairs continued, despite some disagreement from distinct sections of the Jewish community.
Bertha Solomon, who had won her parliamentary seat in 1938 as a member of the United Party, continued her lobbying on behalf of women and children. At the war's end, South Africa gained its first Jewish cabinet minister, Dr. Henry Gluckman, who was appointed Minister of Health. From Siegfried Frankl onward, South African Jewish medical professionals have consistently engaged with the general community health all the way into the present day.
The connection begins if we go back to Maimonides, who we consider the father of Jewish medicine, who grew up in Cordoba in a society of excellence with interaction between the Muslim and the Christian world, who felt that you needed to go and look after your fellow man. And this is something that the communities, wherever they've gone around the world, have been concerned about their fellow man. The stalwart in terms of community medicine was two people. It was a husband and wife couple. It was Sidney Clark and his wife Emily Jaspin, who were Wits graduates. And they got involved in the research of what they called Bantu nutrition. That was the term they used in those days, where they did surveys looking at children in the black communities and their nutritional status. And they then set up a center called Polela in rural Natal, which became the model that was advocated for national health insurance by Dr. Henry Gluckman, who was the Minister of Health under the Smuts government. And he was the one who spoke about implementing national health insurance. The Karks set up this amazing center. They then went to Natal University, where they set up the Institute of Family Medicine. And they were the mentors for a number of people who would become world experts in terms of community or public health. Unfortunately, because of the politics at the time, they had to leave the country. They went to the US and they went on to Israel, and there at the university in Jerusalem, they set up community medicine. A couple they influenced was Mervyn Sasser and his wife Zena Stein, both Wits graduates who'd gone to work with them in Natal as students, and they came to Alexandra Clinic here in Johannesburg to work. Again, because of the political situation, they left and they ended up as professors at Columbia University, professors emeritus in epidemiology, and Zena Stein also in psychiatry. They were involved in setting up a research center in KwaZulu-Natal in Richards Bay. So we've now seen a cycle of people who in the 1930s and 40s, their impact has been felt today in terms of South African medicine.
For a while, there was an unexpected confluence of Zionist and South African politics in the dealings of the community with the government as they lobbied for Smuts to apply pressure on the British government to ease the blockade on British-mandated Palestine. Newly appointed Chief Rabbi Louis Rabinowitz railed against the British government over its mandate policies in his sermon at the service of Thanksgiving after VJ Day. The Grey Shirts and the New Order had ostensibly disbanded after the war, though the Afrikaner nationalists responded to the Allied victory by trying to raise awareness of the suffering of the Germans and further ignored the evidence of the Holocaust. There was still strong antipathy towards the Jewish community from the nationalists, though the aggressive anti-Semitism of the late 30s was muted in the immediate post-war period. As the issue of mandated Palestine moved towards international deliberation, the South African Jewish community was surprised by the measure of sympathy and support that was being shown towards the Zionist cause by the Afrikaner nationalists.
Most of this support was still linked to the implacable resentment against Britain that was a result of the Anglo-Boer War. In a clear-cut example of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, the Afrikaner nationalists would support anything that would bring the British government discomfort. Within the National Party, Eric Lowe still clung to an anti-Jewish policy, though Malan differed with him and eventually issued a statement moderating the party's anti-Semitic stance and claiming that anti-Jewish opinions were not policy. Instead, the nationalists were simply holding to their anti-immigration commitment. Asked if there were anti-Semites in the party, he replied that the answer was yes, but no more so than in Smuts' United Party. And as the election approached, it seemed that most of South African Jews were inclined to the United Party. 1948 brought two major events to the South African Jewish community. One was a source of hope and pride, the other a source of fear and discomfort. In quick succession, the State of Israel was proclaimed, and in a surprise victory, the National Party won the general election in South Africa. It looks vaguely Egyptian, doesn't it?
Be my love when the fire is low, when the fire is low, when the fire. Be my love when the fire is low, when the fire is low, when the fire. Have a wonderful time, it's all forgets right to me. Be like the swallows and remember home as a loving tree. I found silence is best enjoyed with an open heart beating next to you. But for now